The slave
The
market
shadows
in
gather.
Thornhaven,
We must
Montana
act.
smelled
I'm
like
ready.
three
What is your
things.
command?
Follow me.
Desperation,
The shadows
unwashed
gather.
bodies,
We
and
must
the
act.
particular
I'm ready.
metallic
What
tang
is your...
of money changing hands too quickly. Callum Thorne had been to this market exactly once before when he was 12 years old, holding his father's calloused hand tight enough to cut off circulation. His father had told him then, voice low and serious, in that way fathers use when they're trying to pass down wisdom that might actually matter. Some prices aren't measured in silver, son. Remember that. Callum remembered, which is probably why 24 years into his life and standing in the same market that had carved nightmares into his childhood, he did something monumentally stupid. He bought a person, not just any person, an orc woman. Green skin covered in scars that looked like a topographical map of every bad decision she'd ever made, or every good decision that had cost her everything. Broken tusks, the kind of break that doesn't happen by accident, doesn't happen in a fall or a bar fight, the kind of break that's ceremonial, purposeful, designed to mark someone as less than they were. Eyes the color of amber that looked right through you like you were made of glass, and she could see every crack, every weakness, every lie you'd ever told yourself in the mirror. The slaver wanted 7 silver coins for her. 7, Callum had paid more for a decent pair of boots last month. The number was so absurdly low that it made his merchant's instincts scream warnings like a chorus of accusatory ghosts. When something costs nothing, it's usually because it's worth less than nothing, or it's worth so much that the seller needs it gone before someone with sense realizes the truth. 7 coins, the slaver said, scratching his belly through a tunic that had given up being white sometime during the previous administration. He was the kind of fat that spoke of comfort of eating well while others starved. She don't talk much, don't eat much neither. Does what she's told. Perfect for heavy lifting, or well, he winked. The wink was the kind that made Callum want to take a bath in lye and then maybe set himself on fire just to feel clean again. Whatever else you need heavy lifting for. The orc woman stood there, 3 different kinds of restrained. Chains at her wrists, thick iron links that had rubbed the skin raw. Chains at her ankles short enough that she could walk but never run, never escape. And a chain to the post behind her looped through a collar at her neck like she was livestock, like she was property that might bolt at any moment. 3 layers of restraint for someone supposedly docile. The math didn't add up, and Callum had always been good at math. She didn't look at him, didn't look at anyone. Her gaze fixed on something in the middle distance, something that probably wasn't even there, some point on a horizon only she could see. Her hand, even chained, rested against something hidden under her torn tunic. Something she held like it was more precious than gold, more important than freedom. Why 3 chains? Callum heard himself ask. The question came out before his brain had properly vetted it for wisdom. The slaver's smile faltered just a fraction, just enough. Safety precaution. Can't be too careful these days. She killed 3 of my guards last month, a voice cut in. Ragged, tired, the voice of a man who'd learned to cut his losses. Another slaver, older, leaning against a post with the weight of someone who'd seen too much and slept too little. Owner wants her gone before she cost him more lives than she's worth. 7 coins is the going rate for damaged goods that might murder you in your sleep. The first slaver shot the older man a look that could have curdled milk. Callum looked at the orc woman again. Really looked. 3 guards. Dead. And yet here she stood, chained like an animal, priced like trash, silent as a grave. If she'd killed 3 people and they were only asking 7 coins, it meant they were more afraid of keeping her than they were interested in profit. It meant she was dangerous. It meant she was worth something. I'll take her, Callum said. The words surprised him almost as much as they surprised everyone else within earshot. Silas Brennan, a rival merchant who'd been browsing the merchandise with all the enthusiasm of someone shopping for particularly ugly furniture, burst into laughter. It was the kind of laugh that started in his belly and worked its way up through his chest like he was evacuating demons through mockery. 7 coins for that. He clutched his sides, his pockets clinking and clattering, with the nervous habit he'd had since childhood, always counting coins, always calculating, always measuring the world in silver and copper. Callum, my boy, I know your father's business went under, but I didn't realize you'd lost your mind along with your inventory. The coins in Silas's pockets kept up their brass ghost chorus, following him everywhere like a musical reminder that some people measured their worth in metal and nothing else. Callum counted out 7 silver coins. They felt heavier than they should have, like they were made of something denser than silver, something with more gravity. Each one that left his palm felt like a small decision, a tiny choice that added up to something he didn't quite understand yet. "Keep the change," he said to the slaver, though there wasn't any. The slaver pocketed the coins faster than seemed physically possible, like he was afraid Callum might come to his senses and ask for them back. He tossed Callum a key that looked like it had been used to open everything from prison cells to wine cellars' old iron, worn smooth by too many desperate hands. "If she kills you in your sleep," the slaver said, already turning away, already forgetting. "I told you she was trouble." "You told me she was docile," Callum pointed out. "Same thing depending on the day." Callum unlocked the chains. They fell away with the kind of clatter that sounded like freedom or doom, or maybe both at once depending on your perspective and your life choices. The chains hit the dirt and lay there like dead metal snakes, harmless now, empty of purpose. The orc woman didn't move, didn't rub her wrists where the iron had bitten deep, didn't stretch, didn't bolt. She just stood there like someone had carved her from green stone and forgotten to tell her she was supposed to be alive, supposed to be capable of movement and choice. "Can you walk?" Callum asked. She didn't answer, didn't even blink. Her hand stayed pressed against whatever she was hiding under her tunic, holding it like a talisman, like the last piece of who she used to be. Callum muttered to himself, to the universe, to whatever God watched over fools and merchants. "This is fine. This is all completely fine, and not the worst decision I've made this week." He started walking. Behind him, after a long moment, long enough that Callum thought maybe she actually was carved from stone, she followed. Her footsteps made no sound. For someone who stood nearly 6 feet tall and probably outweighed him by 40 pounds of muscle and scar tissue, she moved like silence had been given legs and taught to walk. 3 steps behind him the entire way. Not 2 steps, not 4. Exactly 3. Like she'd measured the distance and decided that was the mathematically correct amount of space between owner and owned. The thought made Callum's stomach twist into configurations that probably violated several laws of physics. Behind them, Silas's laughter echoed through the market. More clinking from his pockets, more demons being exercised through the sacred ritual of counting other people's failures. Callum didn't look back. The walk to his shop took 20 minutes through Thornhaven's main street, and every single one of those minutes felt like being on stage in a theater where everyone in the audience had already decided you were performing a tragedy. People stared. Of course they stared. Thornhaven was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business, their grandmother's business, and their grandmother's cat's business. Secrets here had the half-life of mayflies. A human merchant walking through town with an orc slave 3 steps behind him was the kind of gossip that would fuel conversations for months, maybe years. The kind of story people would tell their grandchildren, embellishing it with each retelling until Callum became either a hero or a cautionary tale depending on the narrator's disposition toward foolishness. Elder Petra Ashford stood outside her small house watering flowers that had no business looking that healthy in Montana's unforgiving climate. She was 58 years old and had survived a war, a plague, and 3 different husbands who'd all had the poor judgment to die before she did. The flowers didn't stand a chance of dying on her watch. She ruled her garden with the same iron determination she'd used to survive everything else life had thrown at her. She watched Callum pass with the orc woman trailing behind. Didn't say anything, didn't call out, didn't offer commentary or judgment. Just nodded once, a single precise movement of her head that managed to convey an entire essay's worth of meaning. The nod said, "I see you doing something either very brave or very stupid, and I'll have my opinion ready after I see which one it turns out to be. Probably stupid. But I've been wrong before. Once. In 1987, Callum's shop was small, wedged between a cobbler and a place that sold dubious meat pies. 2 rooms above it that he'd converted into living quarters after his parents died, within 6 months of each other, his father to a bad heart, and his mother to what the doctor had called complications. But what Callum knew was really just giving up. The shop itself sold fabric. Good fabric, the kind that didn't fall apart after one washing, didn't fade in the sun, didn't betray you when you needed it most. His father had built a reputation on honesty in a town that valued cleverness over truth, and Callum was trying to maintain that reputation with the determination of someone bailing water from a sinking ship using only a teaspoon in spite. He opened the door. "Here," he said, then immediately felt like an idiot. "Here what?" "Here is where you'll live now that I've bought you like a piece of furniture. Here is where we'll figure out what happens when you make terrible decisions in slave markets. Here is the place where we'll both pretend this situation is anything other than fundamentally wrong on every level that matters." The orc woman walked inside those golden eyes, cataloging everything in half a second. The bolts of fabric on the shelves organized by color and quality. The small counter where Callum conducted business with the 3 customers he had left. The stairs leading up to the living quarters. The windows. The door. All the exits. She was measuring escape routes, Callum realized. Planning for the worst because the worst was probably all she'd known for a very long time. "There's a room upstairs," Callum said, his voice sounding too loud in the quiet shop. "Small, but it's got a bed and a window. You can—" He trailed off, suddenly aware of how stupid every possible ending to that sentence would sound. "You can live there. You can be comfortable there. You can pretend this situation is anything other than me owning another human being like property." She didn't speak, didn't react, just stood in the middle of his shop waiting for someone to tell her what shape she was supposed to be, what purpose she was supposed to serve. Callum ran his hand through his hair, a nervous habit he'd never quite broken. 24 years old, and he'd managed to accumulate 1 failing business, 3 regular customers who probably only stuck around out of pity, and now 1 orc woman who seemed determined to communicate exclusively through meaningful silence and the weight of her presence. "You must be hungry," he tried, grasping at the basic human or orc or whatever need for food as a conversational anchor. "I've got bread, some cheese. It's not fancy, but it's food. Real food, not whatever they were feeding you in that place." Nothing. Her expression didn't change, didn't flicker. She could have been carved from jade for all the emotion she showed, for all the life that seemed to exist behind her eyes. "All right," Callum said, surrendering to the silence. "I'm going to make some food. You can do whatever you need to do. Rest, eat, speak, not speak, whatever feels right. There are no expectations here. No demands." He went to the small kitchen corner, little more than a stove and a counter, and some shelves that had seen better decades. Pulled out bread that was only 2 days old and therefore still qualified as edible by bachelor standards. Cheese that hadn't yet achieved consciousness or started its own civilization. His hands shook slightly as he cut the bread, the knife making small, imprecise movements that betrayed every uncertainty he was feeling. What was he doing? What was his plan here? Buy an orc woman's freedom? And then what? Give her food and shelter and pretend that somehow balanced the cosmic scales? Pretend that 7 silver coins could undo whatever had brought her to that market? Broken and chained and silent, behind him, she finally moved. Callum heard the soft scrape of her sitting down on the floor. Not on the chair he had old, but sturdy. Not on the stool by the counter. On the floor, back against the wall, where she could see all the doors, all the windows, all the ways in and out. Where she could see everything coming before it arrived. He turned plate of food in hand. She was sitting there, knees drawn up slightly, one hand still resting on that hidden thing under her tunic, the thing she held like it was more precious than her own life. Her other hand lay loose on her knee, scarred and strong, the hand of someone who'd known violence intimately and survived it. "Here," Callum said, setting the plate down near her. Not too close because close felt like invasion. Close enough to reach because distant felt like abandonment. "Eat, please." She looked at the food like it might be a trap, like maybe the bread would sprout teeth and the cheese would turn to poison. Like kindness was the most dangerous thing that she'd encountered in years, more frightening than chains, more threatening than slavery. Then slowly she reached out and took a piece of bread. Ate it mechanically, chewing without tasting, swallowing without satisfaction. Fuel, not pleasure. Survival, not enjoyment. Callum sat down across from her, far enough away that she wouldn't feel crowded. "Do you have a name?" he asked, knowing it was a stupid question, knowing everyone had a name, but not knowing what else to say. The silence stretched between them like a physical thing, like a creature that lived in the space between words and fed on discomfort. It grew larger and heavier until Callum thought he might drown in it, suffocate under the weight of all the things not being said. Then just when he thought the silence might become permanent, she spoke. Her voice was rough, the kind of rough that came from not using it for a very long time. Gravel and rust, and the memory of what smoothness used to sound like. "My name was Grisha," she said. Each word sounded like it cost her something, like she was paying in pieces of herself just to push sounds past her lips. "Grisha Ironforge. But I don't deserve that name anymore." The way she said it, like she was speaking about someone dead and buried, someone who'd existed once but was gone, now made something in Callum's chest tighten and twist. "Why not?" he asked quietly. Her hand moved to that thing under her tunic again, held it tighter like it might escape if she loosened her grip even a fraction. "Because names are earned," she said, "and I lost the right to mine 3 years ago." Callum wanted to ask more, wanted to understand, wanted to know what could possibly make someone feel like they'd forfeited the right to their own identity. But he looked at her eyes, those golden depths that had seen too much and survived it anyway, and realized that some stories needed time before they could be told. Some wounds needed to scar over before they could be examined. "Well," he said quietly, carefully, like he was approaching a wounded animal that might bolt or bite. "Until you feel you've earned it back, I'm Callum. Callum Thorne, and you're welcome here." Not as he hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't be lies, not as anything other than a person who needed help. Grisha looked at him then, really looked at him like she was seeing him for the first time, instead of just cataloging him as another human, another owner, another link in a chain of people who'd hurt her. Her expression shifted just a fraction, just a crack in the stone facade, into something that might have been surprise or confusion, or maybe just the beginning of wondering if the world still had room for unexpected kindness in dark places. "7 coins," she said. It wasn't a question. "7 coins," Callum confirmed. "You were robbed. Despite everything, despite the weight of the moment and the gravity of the situation and the absolute certainty that his life had just become infinitely more complicated." Callum almost laughed. "Yeah," he said. "I'm starting to suspect that." Something that wasn't quite a smile touched her scarred face, pulled at the corners of her mouth for just a fraction of a second before disappearing like it had never been there at all. But it had been there. For just one moment, Grisha Ironforge had looked like someone who remembered what it felt like to be alive, to be human, to be something other than a broken thing, waiting to be discarded. That night, Callum lay in his bed upstairs and listened to the absolute silence from the room next to his. No movement, no breathing. He could hear just the weight of another person existing in his space, carrying whatever burden had turned her into a statue, whatever history had taught her that silence was safer than words. He thought about his father's words from 12 years ago, thought about prices that couldn't be measured in silver. 7 coins had bought something tonight. He just wasn't sure yet what it was, what it would become, what it would cost him in the end. But for the first time in the 3 years since his parents had died and left him with a failing shop and a town full of people waiting for him to fail, Callum felt like he'd done something that mattered, something that wasn't about profit margins or fabric quality or maintaining his father's reputation, something that was just about being decent when decency had become optional. He fell asleep thinking about golden eyes and shattered tusks and the particular kind of courage it took to keep existing when the world had decided you were worthless. The next morning, Thornhaven buzzed with gossip, the way beehives buzzed with bees, the way fires spread through dry timber, the way rumors always move faster than truth in small towns with nothing better to do. Callum could hear it even before he opened his shop, whispers floating through the morning air like malicious birdsong. Did you hear Callum Thorne bought an orc slave? 7 coins. Can you imagine? Must be desperate. Must be insane. I heard she killed 3 guards. I heard she's a witch. I heard she doesn't even speak. The whispers multiplied and mutated, each retelling, adding new details, new embellishments, new judgments. By noon, Callum figured he'd either bought a demon or a saint, depending on which version of the story you heard, and both versions agreed he was an idiot. He opened his shop and tried to ignore the faces peering through his windows. Customers who'd never been interested in his fabric suddenly developed urgent needs to browse, coming in pairs, in groups whispering to each other like he couldn't hear them, like he was deaf as well as stupid. Is she up there? Do you think she's dangerous? Why would he buy an orc? 7 coins seems awfully cheap. Maybe she's sick. Maybe he's sick. Grisha remained upstairs. She hadn't come down since last night, hadn't made a sound, hadn't asked for anything. The food Callum had left outside her door was gone by mid-morning, the plate set carefully to the side, empty and clean. So she was eating. That was something. Around midday, when the sun was high and the shop was empty, because everyone had gotten their fill of gossip and moved on to other scandals, Callum knocked on her door. "I'm going to leave food outside your door," he called through the wood, feeling ridiculous talking to a door to silence to someone who might not even be listening. "You don't have to eat it. You don't have to do anything, but it's there. And if you need anything, anything at all, just, I don't know. Knock back, I guess. Let me know." No response. But he heard a slight shift in weight on the other side, the subtle sound of someone moving, someone paying attention. She was listening. That was something too. The days developed a pattern the way life always does when given enough time and repetition. Callum ran his shop, sold fabric to the 3 customers who still trusted him, and the occasional new customer who wandered in out of curiosity about the orc upstairs. Grisha stayed in her room. Food disappeared from outside her door. That was their entire interaction. Him leaving food, her eating it, neither of them speaking. It should have felt wrong. It did feel wrong. But it also felt like something was settling, like foundation being laid for something neither of them could quite see yet. On the 4th day, Elder Petra Ashford came to visit. She walked into the shop without knocking, carrying a covered pot that smelled like heaven had learned to cook, and decided to share the recipe. Her movements were brisk and efficient, the movements of someone who'd learned that time was precious and wasting it was a sin. "Soup," she announced, setting the pot down on Callum's counter with the authority of someone who brought no argument. "Made too much again." The way she said "again" suggested she'd never made too much of anything accidentally in her entire well-organized life. This was intentional surplus planned generosity disguised as convenience. "That's very kind of you, Elder Petra," Callum said, because his mother had raised him to have manners even when confused. She waved him off with one weathered hand. "Kind nothing, can't let it go to waste. Waste is a sin worse than most of the interesting ones." Her eyes drifted to the stairs, to the closed door at the top, to the invisible presence that everyone in town was talking about. "She's still up there, yes." Petra said about making herself tea from Callum's kettle, without asking permission, moving through his kitchen space like she owned it, like ownership was just a matter of confidence and purpose. "I was a war widow once," she said conversationally, measuring tea leaves with the precision of an apothecary. "Did you know that?" Callum had heard the stories. Everyone had. Petra's first husband had died fighting orcs 30 years ago, back when the borders were different and the war were fresh, and everyone had someone they had lost to violence. "I spent 10 years hating every orc I'd never met." Petra said, her voice matter-of-fact, no drama, just truth delivered plain. "Hated them for existing, hated them for taking my Tom from me, hated them for being different, for being other, for being easy to blame." She poured herself a tea, the steam rising between them like ghosts of old conversations. "Then I met one," she continued, "wounded orc left behind by his clan after a battle. Was going to die in a ditch about 2 miles from here, bleeding out slow and painful." She sipped her tea. "I saved him. Don't ask me why. Some impulse, some stupid moment of thinking maybe one less dead thing in the world would matter. Nursed him back to health in my barn, fed him, bandaged him, kept him hidden from folks who would have finished what the battle started." Callum listened because Petra's stories were the kind you listen to, the kind that had weight and meaning buried under the surface. "You know what he told me when he could finally talk?" Petra asked. "What?" "He told me that hate is easy. Any fool can hate. It requires no skill, no intelligence, no effort at all. But recognizing personhood in those we're taught to fear, that takes courage most people don't have." She looked at Callum over her tea. "He gave me a stone before he left. Said it was from his homeland, from a river that ran through the mountains. Told me to remember that stones can be weapons or foundations depending on who's holding them and what they choose to build." There was a sound from upstairs. Footsteps slow and careful descending the stairs like someone approaching a cliff edge, testing each step before committing weight. Grisha appeared in the doorway. She looked at Petra. Petra looked at her. 2 women separated by decades and species and everything that should have made them enemies, measuring each other in the silence that stretched between them like a challenge. "Soup," Petra said, gesturing to the pot with the same casual authority she'd used to commandeer Callum's kitchen. Made too much. Eat. Grisha's hand went to that thing under her tunic again, that hidden object she never let go of. Why? She asked, her voice still rough but steadier than before, like she was remembering how to use it. Because I made too much, Petra repeated like it was the most obvious thing in the world. And because letting food go to waste is a sin. You're hungry, I have soup. The mathematics are simple. You don't know me. Don't need to. You're hungry, I have soup. That's all the knowing that matters for soup-sharing purposes. For a long moment, Grisha just stared like she was trying to solve an equation that didn't make sense, trying to find the trap in generosity, the poison in kindness. Then slowly, like someone moving through deep water, she walked to the pot, ladled soup into the bowl Callum offered with hands that shook just slightly, sat down at the small table back to the wall where she could see the doors. She ate slowly, deliberately, like someone relearning how to be part of the world instead of just existing in it. Petra watched her with the kind of gaze that had survived wars and knew exactly what broken looked like, what it cost, how long it took to heal if it ever did. Those tusks, Petra said, casual as commenting on the weather. That was done on purpose. Grisha's spoon stopped halfway to her mouth. I understand orc culture well enough to know that. Petra continued, unrelenting but not cruel. Broken tusks means shame, dishonor, some kind of judgment passed down by those in power. She sipped her tea. But I also understand that sometimes the most honorable thing a person can do is survive what was meant to break them completely. Grisha set down her spoon. Her hands were shaking, not slightly anymore, but visibly trembling, like leaves in a wind only she could feel. I commanded warriors, she said quietly, the words coming out like confession, like testimony, like evidence of a crime. 300 of them. We fought for our clan, protected our people. She stopped, started again. I was trusted. What happened, Callum asked, even though he wasn't sure he wanted to know, wasn't sure the knowing wouldn't change things in ways he couldn't predict. I made a choice, Grisha said. Her voice had gone hollow, empty, like all the emotion had been scooped out, and what remained was just the mechanical delivery of facts. During a raid on a human village in Idaho 3 years ago, there were children, human children. She looked at her hands like they belonged to someone else. The order came to kill everyone. No survivors, no witnesses, no mercy. Standard procedure for raids back then. Make it clean, make it complete, make it so no one could retaliate. Her breathing had changed faster now, shallower. I refused. I evacuated the children instead. 12 of them, sent them to safety to a church across the border. She touched the marks of her dishonor with one finger, gentle, like touching a wound that had never quite healed. My clan called it weakness, she continued. Betrayal. Said I'd forgotten what it meant to be orc. Forgotten my duty, let human influence corrupt my judgment. Her voice cracked. They broke my tusks in front of the entire clan. Made it a ceremony. Made it a lesson about what happens when you choose mercy over strength, when you value enemy children over your own honor. The room was quiet enough to hear hearts breaking, to hear the sound of old wounds reopening. Then they sold me, Grisha said. Sold me to the first slaver, willing to take a disgraced war captain. 3 years I've been nothing. Just a reminder of what happens when you choose wrong, when you think with your heart instead of your head, when you dare to believe that some things matter more than orders. Petra set down her teacup with a click that sounded like a gavel. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard, she said flatly, with the kind of blunt honesty that came from living long enough to stop caring about politeness. And I once watched a man try to milk a bull, so my standards for stupidity are quite high. Despite everything, despite the weight of the confession and the gravity of the moment, something twitched at the corner of Grisha's mouth. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, the memory of what smiling used to feel like. Mercy is strength. Petra continued, her voice hard as iron, certain as death. Any idiot can kill. It takes no skill, no courage, no intelligence whatsoever. Point a weapon, apply force, done. But choosing not to kill when you have the power to, when every part of your training says you should, when your entire culture demands it, that's the hardest choice a warrior can make. That's the choice that requires real strength. Grisha pulled something from under her tunic. It was a tusk. Her own tusk, the one that had been broken, carved with intricate designs that caught the light and told stories and symbols Callum couldn't read. She wore it on a leather cord around her neck, hidden against her skin, carried like both treasure and burden. "This is all I have left of who I was," she said, holding it in her palm, like it might dissolve if she gripped too tight. "A broken piece of a broken warrior. Carved with 47 battles, I won 47 times I led my people to victory. Now it's just a reminder of the one time I chose differently." "No," Callum said, surprising himself with his own certainty, his own conviction. Both women looked at him. He felt suddenly self-conscious, aware that he was 24 years old and running a failing fabric shop, and had no business making pronouncements about honor or identity or the nature of strength. But he'd started, so he might as well finish. "That's not all you are," he said. "You're the person who chose children over orders, who survived 3 years of something that should have destroyed you completely. Who's sitting here now telling us your story, trusting us with it? That's not nothing. That's not broken." He searched for the right words, the ones that would matter. "That's someone who had the courage to be different, to be better, to choose humanity when inhumanity would have been easier. Those 47 victories, they made you a good warrior. But that one choice to save children, that made you a good person. And I think being a good person matters more." Grisha looked at him with eyes that suddenly glistened with moisture, and for the first time since Callum had met her in that market, there was something in them besides emptiness. Something small and fragile and new, like the first shoots of green after a forest fire. Something that might have been the faint, distant beginning of hope. "7 coins, she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Best money I've ever spent," Callum replied, and meant it more than he'd meant anything in his life. Petra stood up, brushing invisible crumbs from her dress with brisk efficiency. "Well," she said, "I'll be going. Shop needs minding, garden needs weeding, and I've got a reputation for minding my own business to maintain, which this conversation is actively damaging." She paused at the door. "I'll be back tomorrow. Probably make too much stew." After she left, after the door closed and the sound of her footsteps faded down the street, Callum and Grisha sat in comfortable silence. The kind of silence that didn't need filling, that existed not as absence but as presence, as shared space and shared understanding. "Callum," Grisha said, finally, his name sounding strange in her rough voice, like she was testing it, seeing how it fit. "Yes, thank you." They were simple words, just 2-word syllables strung together in the most basic expression of gratitude possible. But they carried the weight of someone who hadn't thanked anyone for anything in 3 years. Someone who was remembering that gratitude was a thing that still existed in the world, that kindness could still be real, that maybe, just maybe, she was worth more than the price they'd put on her. "You're welcome," Callum said, and he meant that too. The week after Elder Petra's visit passed differently than the ones before. Grisha came downstairs more often, moving through Callum's shop like a ghost, learning to be solid again, learning to occupy space instead of just existing in it. She helped organize fabric when customers weren't around, her strong hands surprisingly gentle with the delicate materials sorting by color and texture, with an efficiency that spoke of military precision applied to civilian tasks. She didn't talk much, but she was present, existing in the same space without hiding, without retreating to that room upstairs where silence had been her only companion. Then on the 8th day, Tormund Ashwalker walked into the shop. He was massive even for an orc, probably 7 feet of muscle and scars-wearing armor that had seen enough battles to write a comprehensive history of violence. The leather was worn smooth in places where blades had kissed it, the metal dented and repaired so many times it looked like a topographical map of warfare. But what struck Callum immediately more than the size or the scars or the weapons was how carefully he moved. Controlled. Deliberate. Like someone who'd learned to be gentle in a world that expected violence, who'd taught himself that strength didn't always mean force. "Hello," Tormund said in perfect human, common tongue. No accent, no hesitation. The words flowing like he'd been speaking them since birth instead of learning them later. "I am looking for Grisha Ironforge. I understand she is here." Grisha appeared at the top of the stairs like she'd been summoned, like his voice had reached through the walls and pulled her forward. When she saw him, her entire body tensed, every muscle going rigid. Fight or flight, written in the set of her shoulders, the positioning of her feet. Tormund, she said. Her voice was flat, dead, all the warmth that had been brilliant slowly returning over the past week gone in an instant. War Captain Tormund replied, then seeing her flinch at the title like it was a physical blow, quickly amended. Apologies, Grisha. I know you're not my commander anymore. You made that clear when you sold me. The words came out like weapons sharp and aimed to wound. I didn't sell to you. Something crossed Tormund's face, something that looked like regret mixed with shame, old guilt, wearing new clothes. The clan sold you. I was not consulted. He paused, searching for words. I was hunting when it happened. Came back 3 days later to find you gone, your tusks broken. Everything decided without my voice in it. By the time I knew what they'd done, the slavers had already taken you beyond the borders. Grisha's expression didn't soften, but something shifted in her eyes. Not forgiveness, but maybe the beginning of understanding that the world was more complicated than she'd let herself believe for 3 years. Why are you here? She demanded, descending the stairs slowly. Each step measured, controlled her hand, instinctively moving to the broken tusk under her tunic. The clan needs you. The clan can burn. Tormund's expression remained grave, patient, like he'd expected this response and had prepared himself for it. The clan is burning. 3 months ago, the Steelback Orcs declared war. They have allies we didn't anticipate. Human mercenaries, military advisors, modern tactics we don't know how to counter. He took a breath, and Callum could see the weight of it, the burden of whatever news he was carrying. We are outnumbered, outmatched, losing ground every week. 73 warriors dead in 3 months. 2 villages destroyed, burned to ash. Young Kieran Flintstone. He stopped, seeing Grisha's reaction to the name, the way her whole body went still. The boy is alive, but his uncle died last week trying to defend their home. Kieran saw it happen. 8 years old, and he watched his last living relative die in front of him. Grisha's hands clenched into fists, knuckles going pale against her green skin. No, she said, the word coming out like a roar, like mountains crumbling, like everything inside her that had been carefully controlled, suddenly breaking free. I will not help the people who broke me, who called me traitor, who... She stopped, breathing hard, her chest heaving with the effort of containing rage that had been building for 3 years. Tormund stood there, taking it, absorbing her anger, like he deserved it, like he'd come prepared to be her target because someone needed to be, and he was volunteering for the position. I was raised by humans, he said quietly when her breathing had slowed enough that she might hear him. Did you know that Tiawan? Grisha said nothing, but her gaze focused on him with an intensity that would have made a lesser man step back. After my parents died in a raid in Wyoming, a human family took me in. Fed me, taught me their language, their customs, their way of seeing the world. I learned to be orc later from other orcs who thought I was half-blood at best, an abomination at worst. He touched his own tusks, whole and unmarked, perfect and unblemished. They never broke my tusks, but they broke everything else that mattered. Made me prove myself every single day. Every morning I had to wake up and be more orc than orcs, born into the clan, more loyal, more fierce, more willing to bleed for people who'd never quite accept me as one of them. There was understanding in Grisha's eyes now, recognition of shared pain, of parallel wounds. I understand what they did to you was unforgivable. Tormund continued, his voice steady, certain carrying the weight of someone who'd thought deeply about what he was saying. But children don't choose their clans. They don't choose their leaders, their wars, their hatreds. They're just children, and they're dying because adults can't let go of hate long enough to survive. Why should I care? Grisha's voice cracked, the words coming out broken, jagged. Why should I care about a clan that didn't care about me? Because you cared about children once, Tormund said. Because that's what cost you everything. And I don't think 3 years of slavery changed who you actually are, down in the core of you, where it matters. He reached into a pouch at his belt, pulled out something small. A stone, round and smooth, painted with careful colors to look like an eye, decorated with the kind of attention to detail that only a child would invest in making something beautiful. Young Kieran sent this, Tormund said, setting it on Callum's counter with a gentleness that contradicted his size. He collects stones from the creek near his home, paints them, makes them into gifts for people he loves. He wanted you to have one. The stone sat there small and insignificant, carrying the weight of a child's love. He said, "You were the only war captain who ever remembered his name, who asked about his stones, who treated him like he mattered, instead of just being another orphan the clan had to feed. He wanted you to know he still has the stone you gave him 3 years ago before everything happened. Keeps it by his bedroll. Says it reminds him that someone cared." Grisha stared at the stone like it was a meme, like it might explode and destroy whatever fragile piece she'd built in the past week. Her hand trembled as it moved toward it, hovering over it without quite touching. "The council sent me with 2 offers," Tormund continued, his voice taking on a more formal tone, like he was reciting something he'd been instructed to deliver precisely. "First, if you return as war captain, command our warriors in battle against Steelback, they'll restore your honor and pay you as they would any commander. Standard war wages may be 2,000 gold, if we survive." He paused, watching her face. "Second, if you can end this war, not fight it, but end it through any means necessary, they'll pay 10,000 gold coins. It's everything in the clan treasury, Grisha. Everything we have left. Because ending the war is worth more than winning it. Because if this continues, there won't be a clan left to pay anyone anything. 10,000 gold. The number hung in the air like a physical presence. Callum did the math automatically. That was enough to buy 100 slaves at 7 coins each, enough to rebuild a life anywhere, enough to never have to bow to anyone again. "I can't," Grisha whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't go back to that place, to those people who—" "Then don't go back as what you were," Callum heard himself say, surprising himself with his own voice, his own certainty. Both orcs looked at him like they'd forgotten he was there, forgotten that humans could speak and have opinions about orc business. "Don't go back as war captain." Callum continued, stepping forward, even though his brain was screaming at him to shut up, to stay out of it, to remember that this was bigger than him and his investment. "Go back as what you are now, someone who survived, someone who chose mercy when it cost everything, someone who's worth more than they ever understood." He looked at Tormund. "Can she negotiate end the war without fighting?" Tormund's expression shifted into something like surprise, like he'd been expecting a different conversation entirely. Steelback orcs respect strength, but they also respect intelligence. If someone could broker peace, demonstrate that continued war costs more than it gains. He considered it. It's possible. Difficult, but possible. The problem is their human advisor. Former military, knows modern warfare inside and out. He's the one making them effective, teaching them tactics that our traditional approaches can't counter. "I'm not a diplomat," Grisha said. "No," Callum agreed. "You're a warrior who learned that strength isn't just about fighting. That sometimes the hardest battle is choosing not to fight. That's better than any diplomat because you understand both sides. You know what it costs to fight, and you know what it costs to choose differently. I can't do it alone." "Then don't." Grisha picked up the stone Kieran had sent, held it carefully like it might shatter. The painted eyes seemed to look at her, to see her, to judge her in the way only children's gifts could judge, with absolute faith that she was capable of anything. "If I do this," she said slowly, each word chosen with precision, "I'm not doing it for the clan. Not for honor, not for redemption, not for any of the things they think matter. I'm doing it for the children who never asked to be part of someone else's war. For Kieran, who shouldn't have to watch anyone else he loves die. For every child in both clans who deserves to grow up without learning how to grieve before they learn how to read." "That's fair," Tormund said, "and I need a promise from you." She looked at him directly, her gaze meeting his without flinching. "When this is over, regardless of what happens, you tell Kieran his stone is beautiful. You tell him someone kept it safe. You tell him—" She stopped and started again, her voice softer now. "You tell him he was right to give it away, that it mattered, that it helped. Can you promise me that?" "I promise." Grisha turned to Callum. "You should stay here. This is my war, not yours. You have your shop, your life, my 3 customers, and my slowly failing business." Callum smiled, and it felt genuine, felt true. "I think they'll survive without me for a while. Besides, someone needs to witness this. Someone needs to see what happens when broken things choose to be something other than broken. It's dangerous. You could die. I could die crossing the street tomorrow. At least this way, if I die, it'll be for something that matters." Grisha looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for something doubt, fear, second thoughts. Whatever she was looking for, she didn't find it. You're strange for a human Callum Thorne. You're strange for an orc Grisha Ironforge. Good, she said, and this time the smile that touched her face was real genuine. The smile of someone who had found unexpected allies in unexpected places. Strange people change things. The journey to Ironforge territory took 3 days on horseback following trails that wound through Montana's mountains like ancient scars in the earth. Callum had never been on a horse for that long. By the second May, his legs screamed complaints and muscles he didn't know existed. His back ached like he'd aged 40 years overnight, and he was fairly certain he'd never walk normally again. Grisha rode beside him, silent for the most part, her hand occasionally touching the broken tusk around her neck, or the stone Kieran had sent now tucked safely in a pouch at her belt. Her eyes scanned the horizon constantly, reading the landscape the way Callum read fabric patterns, seeing things he couldn't see, understanding terrain the way only someone who'd fought across it could understand. Tormund led the way, occasionally pointing out landmarks, explaining which clan controlled which territory, describing the delicate balance of power that had existed before the Steelback War had shattered everything. On the second night, Callum woke to find Grisha sitting by the fire staring into the flames like they held answers to questions she hadn't asked yet. "Can't sleep," he asked, his voice rough from disuse and exhaustion. "Sleeping means dreaming. Dreaming means remembering." She poked the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkness. "I prefer to stay awake." Callum sat beside her, not too close, giving her space to exist without feeling crowded. "What do you remember?" She was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer, might retreat back into that silence that had been her armor for so long. Then she spoke. "Their faces haunt me," she said quietly. "I see them every time I close my eyes. 12 terrified children who thought I was death coming for them. The weight of the smallest one in my arms, maybe 6 years old, trembling so hard I thought she'd shake apart. The way the oldest boy, couldn't have been more than 14, tried to stand between me and the others, tried to protect them, even though he knew he couldn't." She kept her eyes on the fire, watching the flames dance and twist. "I carried them through smoke and fire, through their village burning around us." The girl was crying, not making sound, just tears running down her face, leaving tracks in the ash. The boy kept whispering, "Please, please, please," like it was a prayer, like maybe begging would change what he thought was coming. Her voice had gone soft, distant, like she was watching the memory play out in the flames. "I took them to human territory, to a church I'd seen during previous scouting missions. Left them at the door with enough food for a few days with blankets as I'd taken from their burning homes. I didn't wait to see if they made it, didn't stay to explain. Just left them there and went back to my clan, reported what I'd done." She laughed, but it was bitter hollow, the sound of someone who'd replayed a decision 1,000 times and still didn't know if it was right. Thought maybe they'd understand. Thought maybe mercy was still part of being orc, still something we valued when it mattered. Thought I could make them see that those children weren't enemies, weren't threats, were just small, terrified things that didn't deserve to die for being born human. "They didn't understand," Callum said softly. "No, they said I'd gone soft. That human influence had corrupted me, that warriors don't save enemy children, that I'd forgotten what strength meant, what honor demanded." She touched the marks of her dishonor, again that habitual gesture of remembering pain. "They broke these in front of the entire clan, made it a ceremony, made it a spectacle, made sure everyone understood what happens when you choose wrong. Then they sold you to the first slaver willing to take a disgraced war captain. I don't even know how much they got for me. Probably not much. Damaged goods, you see. Broken warrior who couldn't follow orders, couldn't kill children when told to. Not worth very much to anyone." Grisha pulled the broken tusk from under her tunic, held it in the firelight. The carved designs caught the flames, made shadows dance across her green skin, told stories of battles won and honor lost. "I've been carrying this as punishment," she said, "as a reminder of my failure, my shame, everything I lost, because I couldn't do what I was ordered to do. Every day, for 3 years, I've touched this and remembered that I'm worthless, that I destroyed myself for nothing, that those children probably died anyway, and I sacrificed everything for ghosts." She turned it over in her hands, examining it like she was seeing it for the first time. But maybe it's not about what I lost, she said slowly, the realization forming as she spoke. Maybe it's about what I chose. What I decided was more important than my own survival, my own status, my own future. I chose to be someone who couldn't kill children even when it cost me everything, even when it meant losing my name, my clan, my identity. What did you choose? Callum asked, even though he knew the answer because sometimes people needed to say things out loud to make them real. To be someone who valued life more than orders, she said, looking at the carved tusk. To be someone who would rather break than become a monster. To choose mercy when everyone around me chose violence. She traced the carvings, with one finger touching each mark that represented a battle won. Some things once broken don't go back to what they were, she said. The tusk can't be reattached, can't be made whole again. But that doesn't mean it's useless. Just different. Different purpose, different meaning. It's not a trophy anymore. It's a reminder, not of failure, but of choosing to be something more than what I was trained to be. Callum watched her face in the firelight, saw something shifting in her expression. Not healing exactly, but accepting. Understanding that broken things could still have value you, that scars told stories worth remembering, that who you became after breaking mattered more than what you were before. When we get there, Grisha said, tucking the tusk back under her tunic, when we face my old clan, I need you to understand something. They won't welcome me. They won't forgive me. Best case, they tolerate my presence long enough to hear what I have to say. Worst case, they kill me on sight for daring to return, for having the audacity to think I might still matter. Cheerful thought, Callum muttered. Despite everything, Grisha smiled. Actually smiled, the expression transforming her face into something younger, softer, more alive. You're already regretting coming, aren't you? Not even a little bit. Liar. Okay, maybe a little bit, but I'd regret not coming more. They sat in comfortable silence after that, watching the fire burn down to embers, watching the stars wheel overhead in patterns that had guided travelers for millennia. Tomorrow they would reach Ironforge territory. Tomorrow everything would change for better or worse. But tonight, sitting by a fire with someone who'd chosen mercy over survival, Callum felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. They reached Ironforge territory on the third day, as the sun was starting its descent toward the mountains. The camp was massive, sprawling across a valley like a small city, hundreds of tents organized in clusters, each marked with clan symbols that Callum didn't recognize, but could sense the meaning of through pattern and placement. But even from a distance, he could see the damage. Burned sections where tents had been, fewer warriors on patrol than there should have been, the particular kind of emptiness that came from a place that had lost too many people too fast. The camp felt hollow, haunted by the ghosts of those who should have been there, but weren't. Children played in the spaces between tents, but their games were subdued, quiet, the play of children who'd learned too young that noise attracted danger, that laughter could be interrupted by grief at any moment. Tormund met them at the border, his expression grave. The council has agreed to hear you, he said to Grisha, but there are conditions. Of course there are, Grisha replied, her voice flat, resigned. You cannot enter as war captain. You come as supplicant, as someone asking a favor, not demanding rights or recognition. You enter as someone who was cast out and seeks to be heard, not as someone who has any claim to authority. Grisha's jaw tightened, muscle jumping under her skin, but she nodded. Understood. And the human. Tormund looked at Callum with something that might have been concern or might have been warning. They want to know why he's here. Why you brought a human to Ironforge territory during wartime when trust is already scarce and suspicion runs deep. Because I asked him to come, Grisha said firmly, her voice carrying an edge of steel that reminded Callum she'd once commanded warriors. Because he's my friend, and I trust him more than I trust most orcs I've known. The word hung in the air between them, surprising and true. Friend. Such a simple word, but carrying weight that Callum hadn't fully understood until this moment. That might not be enough, Tormund said carefully. Then tell them I'm a witness, Callum offered, finding his voice, even though his heart was hammering, and every survival instinct he had was screaming at him to run, to go back to Thornhaven, to hide in his fabric shop, where the most dangerous thing was disappointing customers. Someone who saw what happened to Grisha, someone who can speak to who she is now, not just who she was. Someone who has no loyalty to any clan, no stake in orc politics, and therefore no reason to lie. Tormund considered this, calculating angles and arguments running through scenarios in his head. That might work, he said slowly. Unusual, but it might work. The council values testimony, values witnesses who have no skin in the game, no reason to shade truth for advantage. He started walking toward the camp, Grisha and Callum following. As they entered the outer ring of tents, orcs stopped what they were doing to stare. Some with hostility, some with curiosity, some with recognition that slowly dawned into shock. "That's her," someone whispered. "That's Grisha Ironforge. The traitor. The one who saved humans. I thought she was dead. Might as well be with those tusks." The whispers followed them like ghosts, like accusations, like questions that demanded answers. Grisha walked with her head high, but Callum could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hand kept moving toward the broken tusk, then forcing itself to stop, to remain visible, to not show weakness. The council met in a large tent decorated with weapons and trophies from past battles, skulls and banners and pieces of armor that told stories of violence survived and enemies defeated. 5 orcs sat in a semicircle, 3 males and 2 females, all of them scarred and weathered by decades of warfare, their faces showing the kind of hard wisdom that came from surviving things that killed most people. Behind them stood other warriors, watching with hostile eyes, hands never far from weapons, ready for violence, even in this space that was supposed to be sacred to diplomacy. Grisha walked in with her head high, but Callum could see her hand trembling slightly as it touched the broken tusk one more time before falling to her side. She was terrified, and she was doing it anyway. That was the definition of courage, Callum thought. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward, despite it, to choose action over paralysis. The center counselor, an older male with a face like granite shaped into permanent disapproval, spoke first. His voice was deep, carrying the authority of someone who'd led warriors for longer than Callum had been alive. "Grisha Ironforge," he said, the name sounding like an accusation, like a curse, like something that tasted bitter in his mouth. "You return to us." "Why?" "Because children are dying," Grisha said, and her voice didn't waver, didn't crack, carried across the tent with the same command she'd probably used when leading warriors into battle. "Because the Steelback War is destroying Ironforge from the inside. Because someone needs to end it, and I believe I can." "Why should that someone be you?" Another counselor, female, younger than the others, but no less scarred, her face marked by recent battle, fresh wounds still healing. "You who betrayed us, who chose human weakness over orc strength. You who were cast out, whose name we do not speak, whose existence we do not acknowledge." "I didn't choose weakness," Grisha said, and now her voice gained strength. Certainty, the power of someone who'd had 3 years to think about this, to understand her own choices, to know exactly what she believed and why. "I chose life. I chose to save children who couldn't defend themselves, who had committed no crime except being born to the wrong species, in the wrong place, at the wrong time. And yes, that choice cost me everything. My rank, my honor, 3 years of my life." She touched the marks of her dishonor. "These, but I would make the same choice again. Every time. Without hesitation." Murmurs rippled through the assembled warriors. Disapproval, anger, but also something else. Something that might have been respect from a few younger faces, orcs, who'd grown up hearing whispered stories of War Captain Grisha, and were now seeing her stand before the council unbroken, despite everything defiant in her brokenness. "You admit you would betray us again." The granite-faced counselor leaned forward, his voice sharp as a blade. "No," Grisha said, and her voice was steel now, unbreakable, forged in fires that would have destroyed lesser people. "I admit I would never kill children. If that's betrayal to you, if that's what dishonor means in your definition, then maybe your definition needs re-examining. Maybe strength isn't just about who you can kill, but about who you choose not to kill when you have the power. Maybe honor isn't about following orders blindly, but about having the courage to refuse when orders demand you become a monster." The tent went silent. You could have heard a feather fall, heard breath catch, heard the moment hanging suspended between violence and possibility. "Bold words from someone who comes begging," the counselor said, his voice dangerous, now edged with threat. "I'm not begging," Grisha said, and Callum felt something like pride swell in his chest in watching this woman who'd been beaten down and sold and broken, stand tall in front of those who destroyed her. I'm offering. You need someone who can end this war, someone smart enough to negotiate with steel back, experienced enough to understand tactics, strategic enough to find solutions that don't require more warriors more mothers to bury children, more families to be shattered. She took a breath and Callum could see her gathering herself, preparing for the next words. I can do that, but not as your war captain, not as your warrior, not as someone trying to reclaim what was taken from me because I don't want what was taken. That person is dead. She died 3 years ago when you broke her tusks and sold her like livestock. She stood straighter, somehow growing taller despite not moving. I'm offering to help as someone who learned that strength isn't just physical, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop fighting and start talking. That wisdom matters as much as weapons. That strategy includes knowing when not to deploy your forces. That true victory sometimes looks like compromise rather than conquest. And you brought a human, a counselor noted his gaze shifting to Callum with undisguised suspicion. Why to mock us, to show how far you've fallen, that you now keep human company? Callum stepped forward before he could lose his nerve, before the smart part of his brain could remind him that he was a 24-year-old fabric merchant with no business being in a war council for orc clans, that he should shut up and let Grisha handle this, that opening his mouth right now was probably the stupidest thing he could do. Because Grisha saved my life, he said, and it wasn't true in the literal sense, but it was more true than the actual facts, truer in the ways that mattered. Not physically, but she showed me what courage looks like. Real courage, the kind that chooses mercy when violence would be easier, when everyone around you says violence is the only answer that makes sense. Human opinions on courage are worthless. A warrior spat from the back of the tent, his voice dripping contempt, his hand on his weapon like he was considering whether killing Callum would be worth the political consequences. Perhaps, Callum agreed, refusing to be baited into anger, refusing to show the fear that was making his hands shake. But human observations on effectiveness aren't. I'm a merchant. I know how to negotiate, how to find middle ground, how to make deals that benefit both sides instead of just one, how to turn enemies into trading partners, how to build peace that lasts because it's profitable for everyone involved, because people protect what benefits them. He looked at the council, directly meeting their eyes, even though every instinct told him to look away, to submit, to remember his place. You're losing a war, he said simply, stating fact without judgment. Grisha can help you end it. I can help her do that, can provide perspective on how humans think, how human military advisors strategize, how to negotiate with people who don't share your culture or values. Unless your pride is more important than your survival, more valuable than the lives of your children, more sacred than the future of your clan. The silence that followed was the kind that could go either way. Violence or acceptance, death or life, the future balanced on a knife edge sharp enough to cut reality itself. Then a small figure pushed through the crowd of warriors. Kieran Flintstone, eyes wide, couldn't have been more than 8 years old, carrying a cloth bag that clinked and rattled with the sound of stones. He walked right up to Grisha, completely fearless, completely certain the way only children could be certain about love and family, uncomplicated by politics or history or the weight of adult decisions. You came back, Kieran said in Orkish's voice, the kind of young that hadn't learned disappointment, yet hadn't learned that people leave and don't return, that promises break and trust shatters. Grisha knelt down, bringing herself eye level with the child, and Callum saw her eyes go bright with tears. She refused to let fall. Moisture gathering but not spilling, held back by sheer force of will. I came back, she confirmed, her voice rough with emotion she was struggling to contain. Kieran reached into his bag and pulled out a stone. It was the most beautiful stone Callum had ever seen, smooth and round and perfect, painted in swirls of green and gold that caught the light like captured sunshine, like hope made tangible. This one is for family, Kieran said, his small hands offering it up like a precious gift, like something sacred. Real family, the kind you choose, not the kind you were born with. Tormund said you kept the first one safe, that you carried it all the way here. So here's another one, because you're family, and family comes back. Family doesn't leave forever. Grisha took the stone, and tears finally fell running down her green skin like rivers finding their way to the sea, carving paths through the masks she'd worn for so long. It's beautiful, she said, her voice breaking, shattering into pieces that somehow made it more whole. The most beautiful stone I have ever seen. Your family, Kieran said simply, with the absolute certainty of a child who understood love better than most adults ever would, who knew that family was built, not born chosen, not inherited. And families come back. One of the female counselors stood up. She was younger than the others, maybe 40, her face scarred from recent battles, her eyes carrying the particular grief of someone who'd lost everything that mattered and was still somehow standing. 3 months ago, my son was killed by steelback warriors. She said, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of pain that would never quite fade, that would live in her bones until the day she died. He was 19 years old, had just completed his first campaign, was supposed to have a whole life ahead of him, full of potential, full of future, full of all the things young people are full of before the world teaches them about endings. She looked at Grisha directly, her gaze heavy with the weight of maternal grief. I want this war to end, she said, and there was steel in her voice now, determination forged in the fires of loss. If you can do that, if you can stop more mothers from losing their children from attending funerals, instead of weddings from outliving the people they gave life to, then I don't care about your tusks. I don't care about your past, about what you did or didn't do 3 years ago. I care about the future, about whether there will be one for the children who are still alive, who still have a chance to grow old. Another counselor stood, then another, rising like a tide, like dominoes falling in reverse, until only the granite-faced elder remained, seated, his expression unreadable, carved from stone and stubbornness, in the kind of pride that had sustained clans for generations, but was now threatening to destroy them. This is unprecedented, he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of tradition, of all the ways things had always been done, of resistance to change that felt like the last line of defense against chaos. Good, the female counselor replied, her voice sharp enough to cut. Precedent hasn't been working well for us lately. Precedent is killing our children. Maybe it's time to try something new, something different. Something that doesn't end with more orphans and more graves and more mothers like me who have to pretend they're still whole when pieces of them are buried in the ground. The elder looked at Grisha for a long time, long enough that Callum started to worry, started to calculate escape routes and wonder if they'd make it out alive if this went wrong. The tent felt charged with potential violence, with the possibility that tradition and desperation might collide in ways that ended with blood. Then slowly, incrementally, like a mountain deciding to move, the elder nodded. You have 8 days, he said, and his voice carried the weight of final judgment, of a decision that couldn't be unmade. 3 days to prepare intelligence and logistics. 5 days to negotiate with Steelback to end this war through whatever means you can devise. If you succeed, we will discuss restoring your honor, your place, your name. We will talk about what it means to be Ironforge, about whether our definitions need changing. He paused, letting the weight of the alternative hang unspoken in the air between them, heavy as iron, sharp as blades. Grisha stood holding Kieran's stone like it was the most precious thing in the world, like it represented everything she'd lost and everything she might still save. I'll succeed, she said, her voice carrying absolute certainty, the kind of confidence that came from having nothing left to lose, from being broken so thoroughly that fear became irrelevant. Or I'll die trying. Let's aim for the first option, Callum muttered, quiet enough that maybe only Grisha heard, and she smiled despite everything. Despite the weight of the task ahead, despite the certainty that the next 8 days would determine not just her future, but the future of everyone in this camp. Every child playing between the tents, every mother trying to believe her sons and daughters might live to see adulthood. Kieran tugged on Grisha's tunic, his small face serious, wise beyond his years, in the way children forced to grow up too fast became wise. You'll win, he said with absolute certainty, with the kind of faith that only children could have, uncomplicated by doubt or experience or knowledge of how often the world disappointed hope. Because you're War Captain Grisha, and you're the smartest person I know, and you saved people even when it was hard, and that means you can do anything. Grisha knelt down again, put her hand on the boy's shoulder, her large scarred hand gentle on his small frame. I'm going to need your help, she said seriously, treating him not as a child but as an ally, as someone whose contribution mattered. I need you to do something very important for me. Anything, Kieran said without hesitation. I need you to collect 50 more stones. Small ones, ones that fit in your hand, ones you think are special. Can you do that? 50 stones. Kieran's eyes went wide with the magnitude of the task, but also with pride at being trusted with something important. That's a lot of stones. I know, but they're for something important. For 50 people who need them, who need to remember that someone thought they mattered enough to give them something beautiful, something chosen specially for them. Kieran nodded solemnly, understanding in the way children understand when adults are trusting them with real responsibility, not the fake tasks given to keep them busy, but actual meaningful work. I can do that. I'll find the best stones, the most beautiful ones. It might take me a few days, but I'll do it. Thank you, Grisha said, and her voice carried genuine gratitude, genuine respect for this child who understood things adults had forgotten. You're already helping more than you know. As they left the council tent, as the sun set over the war-torn camp and the future hung uncertain and heavy, Callum walked beside Grisha and thought about courage, about choices, about a price measured in more than silver. 8 days to end a war. 8 days to prove that broken things could still build. That mercy was strength. That sometimes the most important battles were the ones you fought without weapons, with words and wisdom, and the willingness to imagine futures different from the past. 8 days to change everything or die trying. Grisha touched the stone Kieran had given her, held it tight like a promise, like hope made tangible, like proof that someone believed in her when belief should have been impossible. Ready? Callum asked. No. Grisha said honestly, her voice steady despite the fear he could see in her eyes and the set of her shoulders. But I'm going anyway. And that, Callum thought, was all that mattered. The first 3 days passed in a blur of preparation that felt like drinking from a fire hose while running uphill in the dark. Grisha transformed before Callum's eyes, shedding the last remnants of the silent statue she'd been in Thornhaven and becoming something else entirely. Not the war captain she'd been before that person was gone, buried under 3 years of chains and shame, but someone new, someone forged in the fire of breaking and choosing to rebuild differently, to be different, to use knowledge gained through suffering for something other than revenge. She met with iron-forged scouts in worn tents that smelled of leather and weapon oil, in the particular musk of warriors who'd been fighting too long without proper rest. She listened to their reports with the kind of focused intensity that made even hardened veterans straighten their spines and speak more carefully, choosing words with precision, because this woman, this disgraced war captain with broken tusks, somehow commanded more respect through attention than most commanders achieved through rank. She asked questions that cut through assumptions and got to truth underneath questions that revealed she understood warfare at a level most of these scouts had never reached. That her 3 years of slavery hadn't dulled her tactical mind, but maybe sharpened it, given her perspective that came from being on the other side of power. Where exactly were steelback positions? Not approximate, exact. What supply routes were they using and how heavily guarded? Who were their allies, their mercenaries, their weak points? What patterns had emerged in their attacks? What rhythms, what predictable behaviors that could be exploited or understood? Callum watched her draw maps in the dirt with a stick marking terrain features from memory, explaining sight lines and defensive positions with the fluidity of someone who'd spent decades reading battlefields like other people read books. This was her language, he realized. Strategy and tactics and the geometry of warfare. She spoke it with an eloquence that made poetry seem clumsy, that made art seem crude. On the second day, she identified the real problem. They have a military advisor, she told the small group assembled in Tormund's tent. Tormund himself, Callum, and two of Ironforge's remaining senior warriors, both of them old enough to remember when Grisha had been war captain, both of them struggling visibly with whether to treat her as the leader she'd been or the outcast she'd become. Human almost certainly, she continued her stick-marking positions on her dirt map with sharp, decisive movements. The tactics they're using aren't traditional orc warfare. They're modern, disciplined, designed to maximize casualties while minimizing risk to achieve strategic objectives rather than glorious victories. She pointed to marks on her map symbols that meant nothing to Callum, but made the warriors lean forward with recognition. See this classic L-shaped ambush. Standard U.S. Army Ranger School tactics, textbook execution. And here supply line interdiction using small mobile units instead of large raiding parties. That's special operations methodology, not clan warfare. And this pattern here, the way they've been probing defenses, that's reconnaissance, in-force gathering intelligence, systematically rather than just attacking where it looks weak. How do you know this? One of the warriors asked, suspicion edging his voice, old distrust mixing with unwilling admiration. Because I studied human military tactics for 15 years, Grisha said simply without pride or defensiveness, just stating fact. Know your enemy, understand how they think, how they fight, what they vow and fear. It's the only way to survive when you're outnumbered, when your resources are limited, when victory requires being smarter rather than just stronger. She looked up from her map, meeting the warrior's eyes. Whoever this advisor is, he's good. Probably former military, probably dishonorably discharged, based on the fact that he's willing to work for orc clans in what amounts to a private war with no legal standing, no international oversight, no rules of engagement beyond what he chooses to impose. Can we counter him? Tormund asked the question, carrying weight, because everyone in the tent knew the answer might determine whether Ironforge survived the next month. Not by fighting, Grisha said, and Callum could see the warriors tense, could feel the shift in the tense atmosphere, resistance to what she was about to say, building before she even said it. If we try to match modern military tactics with traditional clan warfare, we'll lose. More warriors will die, more villages will burn, and eventually Steelback will push deep into Ironforge territory, and it'll be over. They'll win not because they were better warriors, but because they understand modern warfare, and we're still fighting like it's 100 years ago. The tent went quiet, heavy with the weight of impending defeat, with the recognition that the old ways might not be enough anymore, that the world had changed, and they hadn't changed with it. But we don't have to fight, Grisha continued, and something shifted in her voice, became sharper, more certain, the tone of someone who'd found a path through impossible terrain. We have something better than tactics. We have economics. She drew new lines in the dirt, connecting territories, marking resources, creating a map that wasn't about battle lines, but about trade routes, resource flows, the invisible architecture of prosperity and dependency. Steelback is paying this advisor, probably paying their human mercenaries too. War is expensive, especially modern warfare, with its logistics and supply chains, with professional soldiers who demand regular payment with weapons and ammunition that cost more than traditional orc armaments. They're hemorrhaging resources at a rate that can't be sustainable long-term. So we wait them out, the warrior asked, hope creeping into his voice. No, we offer them something more valuable than victory. We offer them profitable peace partnership that makes them richer than conquest ever could, security that comes from interdependence rather than domination. Callum found himself leaning forward, understanding beginning to dawn, seeing where she was going with this, and recognizing his own role in what came next. This was why she'd wanted him here. Not to fight, not just to witness, but to help build the framework of an offer that would make economic sense to both sides, that would appeal to interests deeper than pride or honor or the desire for revenge. Over the next day and a half, they worked together in a way that felt like two instruments finding harmony, like separate skills combining into something neither could achieve alone. Grisha provided the strategic analysis, the understanding of what each clan needed, what they feared, what they could offer, and what they required. Callum translated it into trade agreements, in commercial partnerships that would benefit both clans more than continued warfare, that would create structures of mutual dependence that made peace profitable and war economically stupid. Ironforge had textile production skilled craftspeople, access to trade routes into human territories through connections Grisha had maintained even during her disgrace. Steelback controlled mineral-rich lands, had metalworking expertise that was unmatched in the region, could produce weapons and tools that Ironforge needed, could provide materials that human traders would pay premium prices for. We're not just offering peace, Grisha explained to the council on the evening of the third day, her voice carrying across the tent, with the authority of someone who'd found certainty in complexity. We're offering prosperity, a demilitarized zone between territories that becomes a shared trading post, jointly administered and jointly profitable. Joint ventures that require cooperation to succeed, that make both clans invested in each other's success. Economic interdependence that makes war unprofitable for both sides, that aligns interests in ways that treaties and promises never could. The granite-faced elder studied her proposal with narrowed eyes, examining the dirt maps and the parchment agreements Callum had drafted with the careful attention of someone looking for traps for hidden costs for the ways this might be a trick. And if Steelback refuses, he asked, his voice carefully neutral, if their pride demands blood instead of gold, if they value revenge over prosperity, then we make sure the right people understand what they're refusing, Grisha said, and there was steel in her voice now, the hardness of someone who'd learned that changing systems sometimes required going around the people who benefited from those systems. Their warriors, their families, their common people who are tired of sending sons and daughters to die for territory that doesn't feed them for glory, that doesn't keep them warm for victories that cost more than they're worth. We don't just negotiate with the council, we negotiate with everyone who has skin in the game, everyone who bleeds when policies fail. Dangerous, the elder said, and there was warning in his voice now, recognition of what she was suggesting. Going around leadership appealing directly to the populace. That's how civil wars start, how clans fracture, how order breaks down into chaos. With respect, elder, Grisha said, and her voice carried the weight of someone who'd lost everything and therefore had nothing left to fear, who could speak truth, because lies couldn't make her situation worse. A civil war that ends this external war might save more lives than continued clan warfare. Sometimes you have to break old structures to build something better. Sometimes the only way forward is through destruction that creates space for new growth. The elder held her gaze for a long moment, and Callum could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the weighing of risks and possibilities, the recognition that desperate times sometimes required desperate measures. Then he nodded slowly, the movement carrying the weight of surrender to necessity. You have 5 days, he said, and his voice was final, absolute. Make it count. On the afternoon of the third day, as Grisha and Callum were finalizing trade terms, working through the details of tariffs and quotas and dispute resolution mechanisms, a scout burst into the tent with the kind of urgency that made everyone reach for weapons. Steelback patrol. The scout gasped, breathing hard from running. 20 warriors approaching from the East Ridge. They're between us and Iron Forge territory were cut off. Tormund reached for his weapon, old instincts kicking in, ready for the fight that seemed inevitable. Ambush. They're going to kill the delegation before negotiations even start, take out our leadership while we're vulnerable. No. Grisha was already moving to the tent, opening her eyes, scanning the terrain with the focused intensity of a predator, studying the landscape with decades of tactical experience, condensing into seconds of analysis. Not an ambush, a test. Their advisor wants to see if I'm really what I claim to be, a warrior who can think beyond violence, who can find solutions that don't require bodies. She turned to the Iron Forge warriors, and Callum could see the transformation, could see the war captain emerging from the broken slave, could see 3 years of suppression falling away to reveal the leader underneath. How many of us, she asked, her voice sharp, commanding. 15. Outnumbered, on bad ground, no cover between here and safety. Grisha smiled, and it was the smile of someone who'd commanded warriors and won battles that should have been losses, who understood that tactics were about thinking rather than fighting, about using terrain and psychology and the enemy's own assumptions against them. Perfect. Get me 5 warriors with good voices, loud voices, and someone who can run fast. 10 minutes later, the Steelback patrol approached the plateau and found it apparently abandoned, except for one orc warrior standing in the open, hands raised, shouting in Orcish about surrender terms, about willingness to negotiate, about desire to avoid bloodshed. They moved to surround him exactly as Grisha had predicted. Standard tactics, textbook execution, the kind of maneuver that had worked 1,000 times before and would work 1,000 times again because it was fundamentally sound, and fell directly into Grisha's trap. Not a violent trap, she'd positioned her 15 warriors in a semicircle on high ground they had reached by circling behind the Steelback position while the patrol was focused on the lone warrior below. Not to attack, but to demonstrate. To show that she'd outmaneuvered a superior force without shedding blood, that she could have killed them all, but chose not to. That victory didn't always require violence. The Steelback patrol leader looked up at Grisha, standing above him on a rock outcropping, realized how completely he'd been outplayed, understood in an instant that every one of his warriors could be dead right now if this woman had chosen differently, and slowly, deliberately lowered his weapon. War Captain Grisha, he said, and there was respect evident in his voice, the kind of respect that came from recognizing superior skill, from understanding you'd been beaten by someone better. Our advisor said you were the most dangerous orc he'd ever heard of. Now I understand why. I'm not dangerous, Grisha replied, her voice carrying down from the high ground, clear and certain. I'm just someone who learned that winning doesn't always mean fighting. That strength includes knowing when not to use force, that the best victories are the ones where nobody has to die to achieve them. She gestured for her warriors to lower their weapons, to step back, to create space for de-escalation. Tell your advisor I passed his test, she said, and tell him I expect him at negotiations tomorrow, ready to help build peace instead of teaching war. Tell him I know he's former military, that he understands what continued conflict costs, that he's smart enough to recognize when it's time to stop fighting and start building something better. The journey to neutral ground took half a day, following trails that wound through territory neither clan fully controlled land that had become no man's land through violence and fear. The meeting place had been agreed upon through intermediaries, a rocky plateau halfway between Ironforge and Steelback territories, exposed enough that neither side could hide warriors, as for an ambush isolated enough that words could be exchanged without an audience, without the pressure of witnesses demanding performance over substance. Grisha insisted on a small delegation, just herself, Tormund, and Callum. Any larger group would look like a show of force, would suggest distrust or preparation for violence. Any smaller would look like weakness, like desperation that could be exploited. 3 was the number that said, we're serious, we're prepared, but we're here to talk, not fight. The Steelback delegation arrived right on time, which told Grisha they were professional, disciplined, taking this seriously rather than playing games with tardiness and power dynamics. 5 orcs, all warriors by the look of them, all carrying weapons, but not in fighting stances, not positioned for immediate violence. And 1 human. He was maybe 45, 50 years old, built lean and hard, like wire rope, with the kind of scars that spoke of real combat, not training accidents or bar fights, but actual warfare, where people tried to kill you and sometimes succeeded. Short gray hair, watchful eyes that cataloged everything and everyone, the bearing of someone who'd spent decades teaching people how to kill efficiently and had gotten very good at his job. Captain Garrett Vale, he introduced himself, his voice carrying a southern drawl that had been filed down by years of military precision, accent worn smooth like a stone in a river, but still recognizable underneath. Military advisor to the Steelback clan, and you must be the famous Grisha Ironforge. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Didn't carry warmth, was just an expression his face made because social convention required it. I've heard stories. War captain who saved enemy children got herself dishonored for it. Romantic tale, if you believe in that sort of thing. Beautiful tragedy, very moving, makes for good campfire stories about the noble orc who chose mercy and paid the price. I don't deal in romance, Grisha said, her voice flat, refusing to be baited into defending herself or her choices. I deal in reality. And the reality is this war is costing both our clans more than either can afford. Resources, lives, futures, all being burned for territory that isn't worth the blood being spilled for it, for pride that doesn't feed families, for victories that leave everyone poorer than before. Strong words from someone who got sold as a slave, one of the Steelback warriors said, his tone mocking his posture, aggressive hand resting on his weapon like an invitation. Accurate words from someone who learned what things actually Grisha countered without missing a beat, without showing the anger Callum knew she must be feeling. I know the price of mercy, the price of pride, the price of choosing violence over alternatives. I've paid those prices in full with interest. She pulled out papers, the trade agreements she and Callum had drafted over the past day and a half, documents that represented hours of work, of calculating values and projecting outcomes, of building frameworks for peace. I'm offering you an alternative to continued warfare, she said, spreading the papers on a flat rock between them, creating a space for negotiation rather than conflict. Economic partnership, shared resources, a demilitarized zone that becomes a trading hub benefiting both clans. You keep your territory, we keep ours, and everyone makes more money than we're currently spending on killing each other. Simple mathematics. Peace is profitable. War is expensive. Choose accordingly. Vale took the papers, read through them with the focused attention of someone who understood logistics and economics as well as he understood tactics, who recognized that warfare was ultimately about resources and will, and that both could be measured, calculated, predicted. His expression remained neutral, professional, giving nothing away. But Callum could see the calculations happening behind his eyes, could see him running scenarios, weighing outcomes. Interesting, Vale said, finally setting the papers down, with care, treating them with the respect due to serious proposals rather than dismissing them out of hand. Well thought out, economically sound, probably more profitable for both sides than continued conflict, assuming the projections are accurate and the implementation is executed properly. He looked at Grisha directly. But you're missing something fundamental, something that makes all these numbers and agreements meaningless. What? This war isn't about economics. It's about honor, about old grudges that go back generations, about pride and territory, and all the things that don't show up on balance sheets but matter more than gold to the people doing the fighting. You can't negotiate away centuries of resentment with trade agreements. You can't buy peace when what people want is revenge. Then help me change that, Grisha said, and her voice shifted, became quieter, more direct, human to human, instead of warrior to warrior, person to person, rather than representative to representative. You're former military, Army Ranger based on the tactics you've been teaching Steelback, based on the way you've organized their operations, the methodologies you've implemented. You know what real warfare costs, what it does to the people fighting it, what it leaves behind when the shooting stops and the bodies are counted and the survivors have to figure out how to live with what they've done and what's been done to them. Vale's eyes narrowed, something shifting behind the professional mask, something like surprise or maybe recognition. How did you L-shaped ambushes, supply, line interdiction, small unit tactics, reconnaissance in force? Grisha interrupted, ticking off points like she was reading from a manual. It's Ranger doctrine, textbook perfect, executed with the kind of precision that only comes from extensive training and experience. You're good at your job, Captain Vale. Maybe too good. But you also know your job is teaching people to die efficiently, to kill effectively, to destroy systematically. And I'm guessing that's not why you signed up originally, not what you thought you'd be doing when you took your oath. Something flickered across Vale's face. Old pain, old regret, something buried but not dead wounds that had scarred over but never quite healed. Why are you here? Grisha asked, pressing the advantage, pushing into the opening she'd created. Really here working for an orc clan in a war that isn't yours, teaching warriors to kill each other over territory, disputes that don't affect you, that have nothing to do with your life or your interests or your values. Money, Vale said, but his voice lacked conviction, lacked the certainty of truth, carried the hollow sound of a lie everyone tells themselves until they almost believe it. Money you could make consulting for private military contractors at 3 times what Steelback is paying you, with less risk and better benefits, with retirement plans and health insurance, and all the things professional soldiers care about. Try again. Vale was quiet for a long moment, and Callum could see him wrestling with something, could see old decisions being re-examined, old wounds being touched. Then he spoke, and his voice carried the weight of confession. Because nobody else would hire me. Dishonorably discharged for refusing an order, for telling my commanding officer that the mission he wanted would result in civilian casualties. We couldn't justify that we had alternatives that would work without killing families, without destroying a village to save it. He didn't agree, said orders were orders, said mission objectives were paramount, said winning mattered more than how we won. I refused to execute, got branded insubordinate, got court-martialed, lost my career, lost my pension, lost everything I'd built over 20 years of service. He looked at Grisha, and there was recognition there now. Understanding passing between two people who'd made the same choice and paid similar prices, who'd valued life over orders, and discovered that the world punished such values. So yeah, Vale continued, his voice bitter now, carrying 3 years or 5 years, or however long of accumulated resentment. I'm here teaching orc clans how to kill each other because it's the only work I could get. Because refusing to kill innocents makes you unemployable in the circles I used to run in, makes you a liability, someone who can't be trusted to do what needs doing. Because I made a choice and I'm still paying for it, will probably keep paying for it until I die. Then stop paying. Grisha said simply, her voice gentle now. Understanding, carrying the weight of someone who'd walked the same path. You refused one set of orders that would kill innocence. Refuse another. Walk away from this war, and I'll pay you double what Steelback is offering to help build the peace instead. Use your skills to create rather than destroy, to save rather than kill. You don't have that kind of money. No, but I will. The council offered me 10,000 gold coins to end this war, to save Ironforge from destruction, to find a way forward that doesn't require every child in the clan to become an orphan. I'm not keeping it. I'm using it to buy freedom for 50 orc slaves, but I'll use part of it to pay you first if that's what it takes to stop children from dying, to prevent more families from being shattered. Vale studied her face like he was reading a tactical map looking for deception, for angles for the trap that had to be there. Because people didn't just offer redemption to strangers, didn't just believe in second chances for those who'd failed. You're serious, he said, and it was half question, half statement, like he was testing reality to see if it matched what he was hearing. Dead serious. You want redemption, Captain. Here it is. Help me build something instead of destroying things. Prove that refusing to kill innocents wasn't a mistake, wasn't weakness, wasn't the end of being useful. Prove it was the beginning of being better, of becoming someone who creates value instead of eliminating it. The Steelback delegation erupted in protest as angry voices, overlapping warriors, objecting to their advisor being recruited, being turned, being offered alternatives to the path they'd all agreed upon. But Val held up one hand and they quieted years of discipline, kicking in respect for authority, overriding immediate reactions. I need to think about this, Vale said, his voice careful measured. You have until tomorrow morning, Grisha replied. Because whether you help or not, I'm ending this war. The only question is whether you're part of the solution or part of the problem that needs solving. That night, camped on the plateau under stars that seemed close enough to touch, close enough to gather like stones and give away as gifts, Callum woke to find someone sitting by their fire. Garrett Vale alone, staring into flames like they held answers he'd been searching for 20 years. Can't sleep, Callum asked, keeping his voice low, not wanting to wake Grisha, who was finally resting after 3 days of constant work. Vale didn't look up, didn't acknowledge the question directly. Spent 6 months teaching Steelback how to kill efficiently. Told myself it was just a job, just tactics, just putting food on the table and keeping skills sharp. But your friend asked me a question today that I can't stop hearing, that keeps playing in my head like a song I can't forget. What question? When does refusing to kill innocents stop mattering? That's what she was really asking. Whether my choice 20 years ago was a one-time thing or a principle I still believe in, whether I'm still the person who valued life enough to throw away his career, or whether I've become someone who just talks about having been that person once. He finally looked at Callum and his eyes carried the weight of someone who'd been running from himself for a very long time. I've been running from that question for 2 decades, hiding behind just following orders when it suited me, and I refused orders once, when I wanted to feel good about myself. Using whichever story made me look better, made my choices seem justified. But the truth is, I've been teaching people to kill for 6 months. Teaching them to be efficient at it, to maximize casualties, to win through superior violence. And I knew the whole time I knew that some of those people dying would be civilians, would be families caught in the crossfire, would be children who just happened to be in the wrong place when war came through. What are you going to do? Callum asked. Vale was quiet for a long moment, watching the fire burn, watching sparks rise toward the stars like prayers, like wishes, like hopes that might or might not be answered. Something stupid, he said finally. Something that'll probably cost me the only employment I've had in years, that'll burn bridges I can't rebuild, that'll make me unemployable all over again. But something I should have done 6 months ago when I first saw Steelback preparing to attack villages with children in them, when I first recognized the pattern of what I was teaching and where it would lead. He stood up, brushed dirt from his pants, looked at Callum with something like determination. Something that might make refusing those orders 20 years ago mean something more than a story I tell myself to sleep better. Something that might prove I'm still the person who valued life over career, or at least that I can become that person again if I try hard enough. The next morning, Vale returned, but not with the Steelback delegation. He came alone, walking across the plateau, with the purposeful stride of someone who'd made a decision and was seeing it through regardless of consequences. "I sent the Steelback delegation back with a message," he said without preamble, without apology, his voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who'd burned bridges and was watching them collapse behind him. "Told them I was resigning my position effective immediately. Told them they could either negotiate with you in good faith or find themselves fighting Ironforge without my tactical support, without my knowledge of modern warfare, without the advantage I'd been giving them." Grisha stood slowly, carefully, like sudden movements might shatter. Whatever was happening might break the fragile reality of this moment. "And," she asked, her voice cautious, not quite daring to hope, "and they're reconvening their council. Should have an answer by midday, should know whether they're willing to talk peace or whether they want to continue fighting without professional military guidance." He looked at Grisha directly, and there was something new in his eyes now, something that looked like the beginning of peace, of settling accounts long overdue. "I also told them something else. Told them about the children you saved, about how you lost everything for refusing an order to kill innocents, about how that's not weakness, it's the hardest kind of strength, the kind that costs more than most people are willing to pay." What did they say? They said that's a human perspective and doesn't apply to orc honor, that I'm projecting my own values onto a culture I don't understand. Vale smiled grimly without humor, but with satisfaction, the smile of someone who'd made his point, even if it wasn't accepted. "So I told them I'd been an orc's military advisor for 6 months, and in that time I'd learned that orc honor and human honor aren't that different when you strip away the cultural bullshit. That both are about having the courage to choose right over easy, to value life over orders, to be something more than a weapon someone else points and fires." Now, how'd they take that? About as well as my commanding officer took it when I told him his mission was murder, dressed up as military necessity, that following orders didn't absolve us of moral responsibility, that we'd have to live with what we did long after the mission was over. Vale shrugged, and the gesture carried years of not caring what people thought, of having already paid the highest price, and therefore having nothing left to lose. "But I also told them the economic reality, that this war is bankrupting them, that they've already lost more than they can gain, even if they win every battle from here forward, that pride is expensive, and they're paying in their children's futures in opportunities that won't exist because all the resources are going to warfare." By midday, the Steelback Council arrived, all 7 of them, more than Grisha had expected, which meant this was serious. They were treating this as important rather than dismissible, as a genuine negotiation rather than a formality, before returning to war. The negotiations took 4 days. 4 days of sitting in a tent that had been erected on the plateau, going over maps and trade routes and resource allocations with the kind of detail that made Callum's head spin, but that Grisha navigated with the ease of someone who'd spent decades thinking about logistics, about supply chains, about the invisible infrastructure that made civilizations work. 4 days of arguing about boundaries and demilitarized zones and who got access to what, of stubborn pride running into economic reality and slowly, grudgingly bending. 4 days of translating cultural values into practical terms, of finding ways to preserve honor while building prosperity, of creating structures that both sides could accept without feeling like they'd surrendered, like they'd lost, like they'd betrayed everything they'd fought for. Grisha was magnificent to watch. Callum sat beside her, providing support when needed, translating human commercial practices into terms us orcs could understand. But mostly he just witnessed her navigate between firmness and flexibility, knowing when to push and when to yield. Understanding that negotiation wasn't about winning, but about finding solutions. Both sides could accept, about building frameworks that serve mutual interests rather than just one side's advantage. She used her tactical knowledge to design a DMZ that actually made defensive sense for both clans, that created a buffer zone neither side could use for staging attacks, but both could use for commerce, for trade, for the peaceful exchange of goods and services that built wealth instead of destroying it. She turned military expertise into economic opportunity, showing how the same strategic thinking that won battles could create prosperity. Vale helped providing the human perspective on trade with human territories, explaining market values and commercial opportunities that orc clans might not recognize, might not understand, without someone who'd lived in both worlds. His knowledge of logistics of supply chains, of the practical mechanisms of moving goods across distances, became valuable in a different way, became tools for building instead of destroying. And Callum translated it all into agreements that were clear, specific, enforceable, not vague promises that could be interpreted different ways, not aspirational language that sounded good but meant nothing but concrete terms that could be measured and held accountable that created obligations and benefits both sides understood and accepted. The breakthrough came on the third day when one of the Steelback counselors, a female warrior who'd lost two sons in the fighting, whose face carried the particular grief of a mother who'd buried children, slammed her fist on the table hard enough to make everyone jump. "Enough," she said, her voice carrying the weight of grief transmuted into anger of pain, turned into fuel for action. Enough dancing around what matters, enough talking about trade routes and tariffs and buffer zones when we all know what this is really about. She stood up and the tent went quiet, everyone recognizing that something important was about to be said, that this moment mattered in ways that couldn't be measured in gold or territory. "My sons are dead," she continued, her voice steady, but carrying an undercurrent of pain that would never quite fade, that would live in her bones until she joined them in whatever came after. Korak and Thrun, 19 and 21 years old. They're not coming back. No amount of territory or pride or honor will resurrect them, will give me another chance to see them grow old, to watch them have children of their own, to hear them laugh at my jokes. She looked around the tent meeting, every eye making sure everyone understood what she was saying, what she was asking. The only question that matters is, will this agreement prevent other mothers from attending funerals for children who should have outlived them? Will it stop more sons from dying for causes they don't understand, for hatreds they inherited, for pride that doesn't feed families or warm homes or create anything except graves? She turned to Grisha, and there was something like desperation in her eyes now, the desperation of someone who'd lost too much and couldn't bear to lose more. "You saved human children when you could have killed them. You chose their lives over your honor, over your career, over everything you'd built. Can you promise me this agreement will save orc children? Not all of them, I understand, about accidents and illness, and all the ways children die that have nothing to do with war. But can you promise it will stop them from dying in battles they didn't choose, for causes they don't understand, because adults couldn't find better solutions than violence?" "I can't promise it will save all of them," Grisha said honestly, refusing to offer false comfort, refusing to make guarantees she couldn't keep. "There will still be accidents, illnesses, the thousand small tragedies that take children, regardless of warfare, that remind us we're mortal and fragile and temporary. But I can promise it will stop them from dying in battles they didn't choose. I can promise it will create a future where children grow up learning to trade instead of learning to fight, where they have opportunities beyond warfare, where they can become something other than soldiers and casualties." The counselor nodded slowly, tears running down her face. Now grief finally allowed expression after being held back for so long. "Then I vote yes," she said, her voice breaking. "For the mothers who come after me, who don't have to feel what I feel, who get to keep their children. For Korak and Thrun, who deserve better than dying at 19 and 21. For every child in both our clans who deserves a chance to grow old." One by one, the others followed. Not unanimous, two counselors still voted against, still believed war was the answer, still clung to pride over pragmatism, still thought victory mattered more than survival. But 5 out of 7 was enough. Majority consensus, democratic decision, the will of the people expressed through their representatives. The war would end. The treaty was signed on the 4th day, as the sun set in colors that looked like fire and gold, and hope bleeding together like the sky itself was celebrating, was acknowledging that something important had happened, that the world had shifted in a direction that mattered. Both both clans represented everyone watching, as Grisha Ironforge and the Steelback High Elder put their marks on parchment that would govern the future, that would determine whether children lived or died, whether families stayed whole or shattered, whether the next generation inherited peace or inherited war. That night, both camps held separate gatherings. Not celebrations, too many dead. For celebration, too much grief, still fresh, too many empty spaces where people should have been. But acknowledgments, relief that the killing would stop, that resources could go to building instead of destroying. Exhaustion that came from surviving something that should have destroyed everyone involved from carrying burdens longer than anyone should have to carry them. Grisha stood apart from the Ironforge gathering, watching from a distance, not quite part of it, but no longer fully separate, existing in that liminal space between outcast and accepted, between past and future. The granite-faced elder approached her, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who'd lived long enough to know that words mattered, that moments like this defined legacies, shaped how people were remembered. "The council has discussed your reward," he said, his voice formal, ceremonial, the voice he used when speaking for the clan rather than for himself. 10,000 gold coins as promised, as agreed upon, payment for services rendered for achieving what we thought impossible. He paused, watching her face, studying her reaction. "And we wish to restore your honor. New tusks carved with your new accomplishments, ending a war, saving both clans, achieving through wisdom what could not be achieved through force. A ceremony acknowledging what you've done, welcoming you back, not just as war captain, but as something more, supreme commander of the three clans' unified military leadership authority, unprecedented in our history." He took a breath, and Callum could see the weight of what he was about to say, could see the elder struggling with offering something he'd never imagined offering. "It's unprecedented. Never in our history has one individual held such authority, commanded such respect, united clans under single leadership. But never in our history has one individual saved us from extinction through diplomacy instead of warfare, through wisdom instead of weapons. You've earned this, Grisha Ironforge. You've earned everything we can give you, everything within our power to grant." Grisha touched her shattered tusks, those broken remnants that had been shame and were now something else entirely, something she'd chosen to make them. "I'm honored," she said quietly, and Callum could hear the truth in her voice, could hear that she genuinely valued their offer, their recognition. "Truly deeply honored, but I'm going to refuse." The elder's eyes widened, fractionally surprised, breaking through the careful, neutral expression he usually maintained. "Refuse. I don't want new tusks. These ones tell a story. I need to keep telling a story about choices and consequences, about breaking and rebuilding, about becoming something different than what you were meant to be." She looked at him directly, her gaze steady, certain. "They're mine now, not shame, not punishment, but proof that I chose mercy when it cost everything. That's worth more than perfect tusks that erase the price I paid, that pretend the breaking never happened. And the position Supreme Commander authority over three clans, respect that comes with unified leadership. I'll accept Peacekeeper instead, not commanding warriors, but preventing the wars that would require commanding them. Not fighting, but building the structures that make fighting unnecessary, that resolve conflicts before they become violence. That's the role I want, the one I think I'm suited for now, the one that uses what I've learned without requiring me to become what I was." She pulled out the list she'd been working on, names and locations carefully documented. 50 lives reduced to ink and parchment, but representing so much more. "And the gold, I'll take it, every coin, but not to keep, not to build wealth, not to secure my own future." She looked at the elder with eyes that had seen too much suffering and chosen to do something about it instead of looking away. "There are 50 orc slaves in markets across 3 territories. I'm going to buy their freedom. All of them. 7 coins each, maybe more, however much it costs, whatever price the slavers demand. And then I'm going to find 50 more. And 50 more after that, until there are no more orc slaves to buy, or until I run out of money, whichever comes first." The elder was quiet for a long time, processing what she'd said, understanding what she was choosing, what she was giving up. "You are the strangest war captain I've ever known," he said finally, and there was something like admiration in his voice, now respect for choices he didn't quite understand but recognized as principled. "And possibly the wisest. The position of Peacekeeper is yours. The gold is yours. The respect of this clan is yours, whether you want it or not, whether you value it or not." He turned to leave, then paused, looking back at her. "Those children you saved, the 12 human children from 3 years ago, do you know what happened to them?" "No." Grisha's voice was barely above a whisper. "I left them at a church and never looked back. Never dared to hope they survived. Never wanted to know if my choice had cost me everything for nothing. If they died anyway, and I'd sacrificed my entire life for ghosts. They survived, all 12. We made inquiries, tracked them down through our contacts in human territories. The elder's voice was gentle now, carrying information he knew would matter. One of them is a teacher now in a school in Idaho. Two joined the military and, ironically enough, became soldiers fighting for the country whose children you saved. One became a doctor, practices in a clinic that serves poor communities. They grew up and lived and became people who matter, who contribute, who have their own futures, their own children, and now, in some cases. He met her eyes. Your choice wasn't for nothing. It never was. You just couldn't see far enough ahead to know that, yet couldn't see the ripples spreading out from that one moment, that one decision to value life over orders. After he left, Grisha sat down, hard legs giving out like someone had cut the strings holding her upright. Callum found her there, tears running down her green face, holding Kieran's stones, like they were the only solid things in a world that had just shifted under her feet. They lived, she said, voice breaking, shattering into pieces that somehow made it more whole, more real. All of them lived, all 12. They grew up. They became people. They have futures. Yeah, Callum said, sitting beside her, his own voice thick with emotion he hadn't known he was feeling. They did, because you gave them the chance, because you paid the price and never asked for receipts, never demanded to know if it was worth it, never required proof that your sacrifice meant something. 3 years, Grisha whispered, and Callum could hear the weight of those years in her voice, could hear the accumulated pain and doubt and self-hatred that had sustained her through slavery. 3 years of believing I destroyed myself for nothing, for a moment of weakness, for children who probably died anyway, and I just delayed it slightly. 3 years of thinking I was worthless, that I'd made the worst choice possible, that I should have just followed orders. But you didn't follow orders, Callum said gently. You followed your conscience. You chose to be someone who couldn't kill children even when it cost everything, even when it meant losing your name and your clan and your identity. And 12 people are alive because of that choice. 12 people grew up and became teachers and doctors and soldiers and parents. 12 people who wouldn't exist if you'd been different, if you'd been able to follow those orders. Grisha looked at him and her eyes were bright with tears, but also with something else. Something that might have been the beginning of forgiving herself, of understanding that broken things could still create value, that mistakes and choices and prices paid could lead somewhere that mattered. Thank you, she said, for seeing me when I couldn't see myself, for believing I was worth more than 7 coins when I thought I was worth nothing, for coming on this insane journey when you could have stayed safe in Thornhaven with your fabric shop and your predictable life. Best 7 coins I ever spent, Callum said, and meant it more than he'd ever meant anything. The next morning, Kieran appeared with a cloth bag bulging with stones. 50 of them carefully selected over 3 days of searching, each one painted or polished or marked in some way that made it special, that made it a gift worth giving. I got them, he announced proudly, his small face beaming with accomplishment, with the joy of completing an important task. 50 stones for 50 people, the best ones I could find. Some are smooth, some are rough, some are broken pieces I glued back together because I thought maybe broken things could be beautiful too. But they're all special because you said they were for people who matter, and if you're giving them stones, then they must matter a lot. Grisha knelt down, took the bag with both hands like she was accepting something sacred, something that carried weight beyond its physical mass. They're perfect, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Every single one. Just like the people, they're going to, just like the futures they're going to help create. When do we give them away? Kieran asked, his eyes bright with anticipation, with the excitement of being part of something important. Soon. As soon as I can buy their freedom, as soon as I can find all 50 people and offer them choices instead of chains. She looked at the boy seriously. And you're coming with me, if that's okay with your family, if they'll allow it. Because you're part of this. You're the one who reminded me that broken things can be beautiful, that people are worth choosing, that family is built, not born. I'll ask my aunt, Kieran said, then paused, his face suddenly serious. War Captain to Grisha, are you my family now, for real? Yeah, kid, I am. If you'll have me, if you want someone with broken tusks and a complicated past and a tendency to make decisions that get her in trouble. Kieran nodded seriously, then grinned with the unself-conscious joy of a child who'd gotten exactly what he wanted. Can I tell people my family includes a famous war captain who saved a whole bunch of people and ended a war? You can tell people your family includes someone who made mistakes and learned from them. Someone who broke and rebuilt herself differently, who chose to use what happened to her to help other people instead of letting it destroy her. Someone who thinks you're the wisest person she knows even though you're 8. I'm almost 9, Kieran corrected with the precision of a child for whom age differences mattered immensely. Even wiser then. The journey back to Thornhaven took 3 days, but Grisha didn't go straight there. She had 50 people to find 50 futures to buy, with 10,000 gold coins that represented everything she'd lost and everything she'd gained, everything she'd been, and everything she was becoming. It took 2 months. 2 months of traveling to markets across Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, following trails that led to places where people were bought and sold, where human lives were reduced to prices and possessions. 2 months of counting out coins, sometimes 7, sometimes 70, whatever the cost, whatever the slavers demanded, and watching chains fall away, watching faces transform from emptiness to possibility, from despair to that first fragile beginning of hope. And at every transaction, Kieran gave a stone, explained in his serious child's voice that it was a gift, that someone thought they mattered, that family was waiting even if they didn't know it yet, even if they couldn't quite believe that someone cared enough to pay for their freedom, and then offer them choices about what came next. By the time Grisha returned to Thornhaven, she had 50 people following her. 50 former slaves, now free, now uncertain what came next, but certain it would be better than what came before certain, because someone had paid for their freedom and given them stones and told them they mattered. Tormund had helped coordinate housing in Ironforge territory, work opportunities, integration into clan life, for those who wanted it, and independence for those who didn't, support structures that help people transition from slavery to freedom without leaving them stranded, without abandoning them to figure it out alone. Callum met her at the edge of town, standing outside his small fabric shop, like he'd been waiting, like he'd known she'd come back, even though she'd never promised to, even though she could have gone anywhere with her new position and her new purpose. 7 coins, he said, smiling, his voice carrying warmth and recognition, and the particular joy of seeing someone become more than they were. Do you know what you're worth now? Grisha looked back at the 50 people she'd freed, at Kieran, walking beside her with his bag of remaining stones, at the life she'd built from the wreckage of everything she'd lost. Yeah, she said, I do. Not in gold or honor or positions or titles. In choices. In the people who got second chances because someone gave me one. In the difference between who I was told to be and who I chose to become. In the knowledge that broken things can still build, can still create, can still matter. She pulled the broken tusk from under her tunic, held it in the fading light. I'm going to bury this. Not to forget, not to erase, not to pretend the breaking never happened, but to plant, to turn shame into foundation, pain into purpose, breaking into becoming. Where? Callum asked. At the DMZ, right in the middle of the zone, where Ironforge and Steelback meet, where enemies are learning to be partners, where violence is transforming into commerce. I'm going to plant a garden there, a place where broken things grow into something new, where people can remember that peace is built from the pieces of what war destroyed. Need help planting? Always. They walked together through Thornhaven, through streets where people stared and whispered, but with different tone now. Not horror or fear or judgment, but curiosity. Respect, the beginning of understanding that sometimes the strangest stories are the truest ones, that sometimes the most unlikely people change the world in ways that matter. Elder Petra Ashford was watering her impossible flowers, and she smiled when she saw them. Didn't say anything, just nodded approval. Recognition, the acknowledgement that Callum had made the right choice after all, that 7 coins had bought something more valuable than anyone could have predicted. That night in the garden plot at the DMZ zone, that would take years to fully grow, but was already beginning, Grisha knelt in the dirt and buried her broken tusk. Carefully, reverently, like planting a seed that would grow into something she couldn't quite envision yet, but could feel the shape of, could sense the potential, waiting in dark earth. Kieran helped digging with small hands, placing stones around the spot where the tusk went into the earth. 50 stones for 50 people, marking the perimeter of what would become a garden, a memorial, a promise that broken things could still build, could still create, could still transform shame into growth. What will you grow here? Kieran asked, his voice carrying the simple curiosity of a child who understood gardens were about more than plants. Everything, Grisha said. Flowers that don't care about clan boundaries, that bloom for anyone who looks, that create beauty without asking permission. Vegetables that feed whoever's hungry, regardless of their tusks or their honor or their past. A place where people can come and remember that mercy is strength, that choosing life over death costs everything and is worth it anyway. Will you stay? Callum asked. Or will you keep traveling, keep freeing slaves, keep building this thing you've started? Both, Grisha said, standing, brushing dirt from her hands, looking at the plot that was bare now but wouldn't stay that way. I'll be peacekeeper, preventing wars, negotiating between clans, building frameworks for peace. I'll be gardener, tending this place, creating space for remembering and healing. And I'll be liberator, finding more people who need second chances, who need someone to pay for their freedom and tell them they matter. It's not either or. It's all of it, simultaneously, all the roles combining into something new. She stood looking at the bare earth that would become a garden. You taught me that you know, that you don't have to be one thing, that broken doesn't mean finished, that 7 coins can buy something worth more than 10,000 gold if you're willing to see value where others see waste potential, where others see damaged goods. I just saw a person who needed help, Callum said. No, you saw someone worth saving even when she didn't see it herself. That's different. That's the kind of seeing that changes things, that saves things, that builds futures from ruins. Years later, when people asked Callum Thorne about the Orc War, about how peace was finally achieved after decades of violence, about what it meant and why it mattered, he always told them the same thing. It wasn't about grand gestures or heroic battles or any of the things songs are made of, any of the dramatic moments that made good stories. It was about one person choosing mercy when violence would have been easier, when everyone around her said violence was the only answer that mattered, the only response that made sense. It was about a child who gave stones to people he loved, who understood family better than most adults, who knew that connection was built through choice rather than inherited through blood. It was about recognizing that strength isn't just physical force, but the courage to build instead of destroy, to choose life instead of death, to value future over past. And when they asked what happened to Grisha Ironforge, the legendary war captain who disappeared into slavery and returned to end a war without fighting, Callum would smile. She planted a garden, he'd say, right where she buried her past, her shame, her broken tusks. She turned pain into growth, loss into purpose. Proved that broken things don't need to be fixed to be valuable, don't need to be restored to their original state to matter. They just need to be reimagined, rebuilt, given new purpose and new meaning. The garden still grows there at the edge of what used to be Ironforge territory, but is now shared land, neutral ground, proof that enemies can become partners when economics outweighs ego, when mutual benefit matters more than pride. Grisha tends it when she's not traveling, when she's not negotiating between clans, when she's not buying freedom for the 147th orc slave she's liberated with money earned from preventing wars instead of fighting them. She's become valuable in a different way, valuable because she can see solutions others miss, can build bridges others don't think to construct. Kieran helps now 9 years old and already showing the wisdom of someone twice his age, still collecting stones, still giving them away to people who need to remember they matter. He brings children from both clans, Ironforge and Steelback, kids playing together, learning together, growing up without the hatred that had defined their parents' generation, without the assumption that difference meant enemy. Callum visits when he can, bringing seeds from human lands, teaching young orcs about trade and commerce, and the power of economic interdependence, showing them that prosperity can be built through cooperation rather than conquest. His fabric business is thriving, now expanded into multiple territories, proof that peace is profitable for everyone involved, that there's more money in building than in destroying. And somewhere in that garden, buried deep in soil that's been enriched by years of composted grief and watered by the tears of people learning to let go of old wounds, a broken tusk rests. Not forgotten, not erased, not hidden away in shame, but transformed into foundation for something new, into the seed from which growth emerged, into proof that breaking can be the beginning rather than the end. Because that's what redemption really is. Not erasing the past, not pretending it never happened, not fixing what's broken back into its original shape, but choosing to build something different with the pieces that remain. Choosing to be something new instead of trying to recreate something old. Choosing to grow instead of staying frozen in the moment of breaking. Grisha Ironforge chose to be someone worth saving even when the world told her she wasn't, even when her own people broke her, for being too merciful, too human, too willing to value life over orders. That choice changed everything. It ended a war. It freed 147 slaves and counting. It built a garden where there had been only wasteland. It proved that broken tusks could tell better stories than perfect ones, that shame could transform into purpose, that mercy was the hardest and most necessary kind of strength. And it all started with 7 coins, 7 silver coins that bought freedom from chains, but required courage from everyone involved to buy freedom from shame, from the past, from the weight of other people's judgments. 7 coins. Best investment anyone ever made. The price of mercy paid in full, returning value that compounds forever in lives saved, futures built, children who grow up knowing peace instead of war, and gardens that bloom where there should only be barren ground.